At 8:14 a.m. on January 5, 1943, Lieutenant Red Cochran stood behind a 5-inch anti-aircraft gun aboard the USS Helena, watching 4 Japanese dive bombers pull away from their attack run. The enemy aircraft had already struck one had scored a direct hit on the New Zealand light cruiser Achilles, sailing nearby. The raid was over. The Japanese were withdrawing. Most gunners would have let them go. Cochran did not. He ordered his crew to open fire on the retreating bombers. It was almost a casual decision, an afterthought, really. The aircraft were already at extreme range. Nothing more than shrinking dots against the morning sky over Guadalcanal. Hitting them with conventional anti-aircraft fire would require either incredible luck or divine intervention. Cochran had neither. What he had was something the Japanese did not know existed. His gun crew fired 3 salvos. One of those shells passed within 70 feet of a fleeing ID-3, a dive bomber, and exploded without ever touching it. The bomber disintegrated in mid-air. The Japanese pilot never knew what killed him. Neither did Japanese intelligence. Neither did most of the American sailors watching from nearby ships. They had just witnessed the combat debut of one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Second World War, a weapon so classified that its very existence was protected at the same level as the atomic bomb. It was called the proximity fuse, and it would change the nature of warfare forever. To understand why this small device mattered so much, you have to understand what anti-aircraft warfare looked like before it existed. On December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, American anti-aircraft gunners faced an impossible mathematical problem. To shoot down an airplane with the conventional artillery shell, you had to hit it directly, not near it, not close to it. You had to physically strike a moving target traveling at hundreds of miles an hour with the projectile you had fired seconds earlier. The odds were terrible. Military analysts estimated that it took between 1,000 and 2,000 anti-aircraft shells to bring down a single enemy aircraft. Some estimates ran even higher. 20,000 rounds per kill was not unheard of during the early months of the war. The problem was not the guns. American 5-in anti-aircraft guns were accurate and powerful. The problem was the fuses. Every artillery shell needs a fuse to detonate it. Before the proximity fuse, anti-aircraft shells used one of 2 types. Contact fuses exploded when the shell physically struck something. Time fuses exploded after a preset number of seconds, detonating the shell at what gunners hoped would be the right altitude. Both had fatal limitations. Contact fuses required a direct hit on a fast-moving target no larger than a truck flying through 3-dimensional space at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. The mathematical probability of such a hit was vanishingly small. Time fuses were slightly better, but still deeply flawed. Gunners had to estimate the altitude and distance of incoming aircraft, calculate how long their shells would take to reach that point, and set mechanical timers accordingly. If their calculations were off by even a fraction of a second, the shell would explode too early or too late. Either way, it would miss. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, American anti-aircraft batteries fired thousands of rounds into the sky. They shot down exactly 0 Japanese aircraft with conventional anti-aircraft fire. The handful of enemy planes destroyed by ground fire were hit by machine guns at close range or by pure luck. But the failure of American anti-aircraft guns that morning caused another tragedy that few people remember. Many of those thousands of shells fired into the sky over Pearl Harbor were equipped with time fuses that malfunctioned or were improperly set. Instead of exploding in the air, they fell back to Earth and detonated in the streets of Honolulu. 5-in naval shells weighing 55 pounds each crashed into residential neighborhoods and exploded on impact. 49 civilians died that day. 32 of them were killed, not by Japanese bombs, but by American anti-aircraft shells that fell back into the city. Entire families were wiped out. A 3-month-old infant named Janet Yumiko was killed along with her mother and aunt when a shell struck their home. A restaurant owner named Jitsuo Hiyasaki died with his 3 children, a 14-year-old cousin, and several customers when a shell flew through the window of his diner and exploded. The youngest victim was 3 months old. The oldest was 50. The American military killed more civilians in Honolulu that morning than Japanese pilots did. This was the brutal reality of anti-aircraft warfare in 1941. Your shells either missed the target entirely or fell back to Earth and killed your own people. There was no good option. There was only the terrible mathematics of chance. But in a laboratory in Washington, physicist named Merle Tuve believed he could change those mathematics. Tuve was not a military man. He was a scientist at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, a research facility that had nothing to do with weapons development. Before the war, Tuve had studied cosmic rays and the Earth's magnetic field. He had no background in ordnance, no experience with artillery, no expertise in military technology. What he did have was a radical idea. What if you could build a fuse that did not require a direct hit? What if the shell itself could sense when it was close to a target and detonate automatically? What if you could essentially make the target 50 times larger by eliminating the need for physical contact? The concept was not entirely new. Scientists in multiple countries had theorized about proximity fuses since the 1930s. The British had been working on the problem since 1939. The Germans had explored over 30 different designs, but no one had been able to make it work. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. A proximity fuse would essentially need to be a tiny radar set, a complete radio transmitter and receiver small enough to fit in the nose of an artillery shell. It would need to survive being fired from a gun, an event that generates forces of 20,000 times the force of gravity. It would need to withstand spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute as the shell traveled through the air. It would need to work reliably in combat conditions, in rain and cold and salt spray. Most critically, it would need vacuum tubes. In 1940, before the invention of solid-state electronics, all radio equipment depended on fragile glass vacuum tubes. The idea of a vacuum tube surviving the violent forces inside a gun barrel seemed absurd. Glass tubes shattered if you dropped them on the floor. How could they possibly survive being fired from a cannon? In August of 1940, Vannevar Bush, the head of the newly formed National Defense Research Committee, gave Tuve the job of figuring it out. Bush assigned him a small team and a code name. They would be called Section T. The T stood for Tuve. Tuve's first act was to post a series of rules on the laboratory walls. They read like the commandments of a man who understood that lives depended on speed. I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time. Shoot for an 80% job. We can't afford perfection. Don't try for an A. In a war, D is necessary and enough, but an F is fatal. The best job in the world is a total failure if it is too late. Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure, there is our failure. Regardless of who is technically responsible, it is our job to achieve the end result. These words hung on the walls as Tuve's team began the seemingly impossible work of shrinking a radar set small enough to fit inside a projectile and making it tough enough to be fired from a gun. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. James Van Allen was a young physicist from Iowa who had joined Section T in 1940. Before the war, he had worked on cosmic ray research. Now, he was tasked with solving the most critical problem facing the proximity fuse program: the vacuum tubes. Van Allen approached the problem systematically. He obtained miniature vacuum tubes designed for hearing aids. They were the smallest commercially available tubes in existence. He dropped them on concrete floors and fired them from guns to see how they broke. The answer was always the same. The filaments inside the tubes, hair-thin wires that glowed when electricity passed through them, would distort and break under the tremendous forces of firing. The tubes shattered not from the impact of glass breaking, but from the internal components tearing themselves apart. Van Allen had what he later described as a moment of inspiration. What if you could suspend the filament on a tiny coil spring? The spring would absorb the shock of firing, keeping the filament under constant tension, instead of allowing it to whip around and break. He sketched the design on paper: a minute coil spring wrapped around a mandrel, with one end of the filament welded to the spring's free end. The spring would maintain nearly constant tension on the filament during acceleration through the gun barrel. It would also tune the microphonics outside the frequency passband of the amplifier, preventing false signals. Van Allen handed his sketch to a technician named Wood, who executed the idea using the microscopic skills of the women who built the original hearing aid tubes. The scheme worked. The tubes survived, but the vacuum tubes were only one of dozens of engineering problems that had to be solved. The fuse needed a power source. Conventional batteries of the era were too large and too unreliable. They went flat, sitting on warehouse shelves, making them useless for ammunition that might be stored for months before being fired. The National Carbon Company, predecessor of engineers, developed a battery that remained completely inert until the moment a shell was fired. Inside the fuse, a glass ampule filled with electrolyte sat enclosed by stacked metal plates. When the shell was launched, the immense acceleration shattered the ampule. As the projectile spun, centrifugal force pushed the electrolyte across the plates, instantly creating a functioning wet cell battery. This reserve battery offered nearly unlimited shelf life. Ammunition could sit in storage for years without losing reliability. It activated only when needed, supplying stable power to the fuse electronics. During the shell's brief flight, safety, however, posed a critical challenge. The fuse housed a detonator connected to the main explosive charge, and any premature activation could be catastrophic, detonating inside the gun barrel or just beyond the muzzle, killing the crew and destroying the weapon. To prevent this, engineers built in multiple safeguards. The battery would not activate until several milliseconds after firing, ensuring the shell was already well clear of the gun. In addition, the shell's own spinning motion armed a set of secondary safety devices. Deliberately misaligned internal components would only rotate into their firing positions after the projectile had reached full spin. Early field tests uncovered surprising issues. Some fuses detonated prematurely, exploding far short of their targets. Investigators traced the problem to the oscillator tubes, which were picking up interference from their own filaments. The original dual filament design created a beat frequency between the filaments, producing microphonic noise within the amplifier's audio frequency passband. This stray noise was enough to trigger false detonations. A Lutetheson required switching to a single filament oscillator tube. It was a small change, but it took months to identify the problem and implement the fix. Every such delay meant more American sailors dying under Japanese air attack. Testing was conducted at multiple sites across the country. The Naval Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia hosted thousands of test firings over the Towac River. Shells were fired at aircraft suspended between towers at a facility near Socorro, New Mexico. Kirtland Air Force Base conducted almost 50,000 test firings between 1942 and 1945. Each test revealed new problems to solve. Moisture infiltration caused circuit failures. Heat from the firing damaged components. The tremendous centrifugal forces of spinning distorted the antenna geometry. One by one, the engineers found solutions. They potted the electronics in wax and oil to equalize stresses. They strengthened mounting points. They refined the manufacturing tolerances until the fuses could survive conditions that would destroy any civilian electronic equipment. The Sylvania Electric Company proved essential to the program. Their expertise in miniature vacuum tube manufacturing, developed for the hearing aid industry, gave them unique capabilities. Sylvania established multiple production facilities specifically for proximity fuse components, including a plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, where hundreds of women assembled the delicate tubes by hand. These women worked under extraordinary secrecy. They were searched, entering and leaving the plant. They could not bring purses or personal items into the work area. Even the local police and fire departments were forbidden from entering the building. Many worked the entire war without knowing what they were making. Some thought they were building light bulb components. Others assumed it was some kind of radio equipment. One woman who worked at the Ipswich plant later described her experience. "We were told it was important war work," she said. "We were told lives depended on us doing it right, but we were not told what it was. Not until after the war ended did we learn we had been building the proximity fuse. The secrecy extended throughout the production chain. Over 2,000 suppliers and sub-suppliers contributed components, from powder manufacturers to machine shops. Most had no idea how their parts would be used. The compartmentalization was deliberate. If any single worker or company was captured or compromised, they could reveal nothing useful to the enemy. By late autumn of 1942, the first Section T radio proximity fuses were coming off the production line. Each fuse contained approximately 100 to 30 miniaturized electronic parts, including 5 Van Allen spring-loaded vacuum tubes. The entire assembly fit in the nose cone of a 5-in naval shell. The fuse worked on a simple principle. A small radio transmitter inside the fuse continuously broadcast a signal using the shell's metal body as an antenna. When that signal bounced back from a nearby target, a receiver detected the reflection. As the shell approached the target, the reflected signal grew stronger. When it reached a predetermined threshold, typically around 70 feet from the target, the receiver triggered a thiron tube that acted as an electronic switch. This released electrical energy stored in a tiny capacitor, which set off a detonator which exploded the main charge. The shell did not need to hit the target. It only needed to get close. A near miss became a kill. The Navy tested the new fuse in August of 1942 aboard the light cruiser USS Cleveland during its shakedown cruise in the Chesapeake Bay. The targets were 3 small pilotless drones under remote radio control. Operators made the drones perform evasive maneuvers, banking, and diving to simulate enemy aircraft. The gunners brought down all 3 drones on the first day of testing. They used only 4 bursts of proximity-fused ammunition. The Navy canned the remainder of the scheduled 2-day test. There was nothing left to prove. Production began immediately. Crossley Corporation, RCA, Eastman, Kodak, General Electric, and McKay Norris all received contracts to manufacture the fuses. Eventually, over 100 American factories would participate in the program, employing thousands of workers, most of them women, who assembled the delicate components by hand. The workers were not told what they were making. The proximity fuse program had a security classification equal to the Manhattan Project. Employees were searched when they entered and left the plants. They were forbidden from discussing their work with anyone, including family members. Many spent the entire war assembling tiny radio components without ever knowing their purpose. By the end of 1942, the Navy had 5,000 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition ready for combat. They shipped them to the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor under heavy guard. James Van Allen himself received a spot commission as a lieutenant junior grade in the Naval Reserve and traveled to the Pacific to train gunnery officers in the use of the new weapon. There was one critical restriction. The proximity fuse could only be used over open water, where unexploded shells would fall into the ocean and sink beyond enemy reach. The combined chiefs of staff were terrified that a dud might be recovered by the Japanese or Germans, who could then reverse engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. The secret had to be protected at all costs. This restriction meant the Army could not use proximity fuses in ground combat. Artillery shells fired over land would inevitably produce duds that might fall into enemy hands. So the revolutionary weapon remained a naval secret, used only in ship-to-ship and ship-to-air engagements far from shore. The fuses were distributed to only 3 ships initially. The carriers Enterprise and Saratoga and the light cruiser Helena were identified as the vessels most likely to come under Japanese air attack. Each received a carefully guarded allocation of the new ammunition with strict instructions on its use. D. Parsons, the naval ordnance officer who had been instrumental in the fuse's development, personally accompanied the shipment to the Pacific. He consulted with Admiral William Halsey about which ships faced the greatest threat and supervised the distribution of the precious ammunition. On January 5, 1943, the proximity fuse entered combat for the first time aboard the Helena. Lieutenant Cochrane and his crew brought down that fleeing Japanese dive bomber with a weapon the enemy did not know existed. The engagement was almost anticlimactic. The Japanese aircraft were departing after their attack run. One had scored a hit on the Achilles. The raid was essentially over. Cochrane's decision to fire at the retreating bombers was more about training his crew than about stopping an active threat. Yet those few shots changed history. The bomber that fell from the sky was the first aircraft ever destroyed by a proximity fuse in combat. The kill demonstrated that the weapon worked as designed, that all the years of development and testing had produced something that functioned in the chaos of actual battle. Word spread quickly through the fleet. Within weeks, other ships began receiving allocations of the new ammunition. Gunnery officers who had trained with Van Allen and Parsons taught their crews the proper tactics for employing the weapon. Confidence in American anti-aircraft defenses began to grow. Over the following months, the results were dramatic. Before the proximity fuse, Navy gunners needed an average of 1,000 to 2,000 rounds to bring down a single enemy aircraft. With the new fuse, that number dropped to around 250 rounds per kill. Against kamikaze aircraft flying straight and level toward their targets, the improvement was even more dramatic. By 1943, although only about 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition issued to the fleet had proximity fuses, those shells accounted for approximately 50% of Japanese aircraft shot down by anti-aircraft fire. The fuse was roughly 300% more effective than conventional time fuses. By 1945, that effectiveness ratio had climbed to nearly 600%. And the small group of ships supported by fighter aircraft managed to shoot down or turn back nearly all of them. The Hadley alone accounted for 23 enemy planes, an all-time naval record for a single engagement. The Evans shot down 19 more before both destroyers had to retire from the fight, each hit by multiple suicide aircraft that were themselves ablaze from anti-aircraft fire when they struck. The ship's gunnery officer later described the proximity fuse as indispensable. Throughout the Pacific campaign, it built an extraordinary combat record. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American carrier task forces faced waves of Japanese attacks, more than 500 aircraft in what would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Between American fighters and anti-aircraft fire, the assault was annihilated, and Japan's naval air power never recovered. Van Allen himself witnessed the fuse in action. He had traveled to the Pacific to train gunnery officers and was standing on the bridge of the battleship USS Washington when a Japanese kamikaze aircraft charged toward the ship. The Washington erupted in gunfire, including 5-inch shells armed with proximity fuses. Van Allen saw 2 or 3 bursts detonate near the incoming plane. Moments later, the aircraft plunged into the sea several hundred yards short of the ship, shredded by shrapnel before it could complete its suicide dive. The physicist who had designed the shock-absorbing spring that made the fuse possible had just watched his own invention save the vessel he stood upon. Japanese pilots began reporting increasingly baffling encounters. Aircraft were being destroyed by explosions that seemed to erupt from empty air, no visible shell strike, no apparent source of the blast. Military intelligence officers analyzed wreckage and questioned captured American aircrew, yet found no answers. Some Japanese commanders speculated that the U.S. had developed a vastly improved time fuse. Others suspected a form of magnetic detection. No one imagined the truth. The idea of a miniature, self-contained radar system small enough to fit into a shell's nose lay entirely beyond their technological expectations. Japanese anti-aircraft research had taken a very different path. They experimented with acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound and electrostatic fuses that detected changes in electrical fields. None proved effective. The radio proximity fuse required a combination of miniaturization, manufacturing precision, and mass production capability that Japanese industry could not match. Germany faced the same fundamental problem. German scientists had been working on proximity fuses since 1930, longer than anyone else. They developed over 30 different designs. But German industry, strained by the demands of a two-front war and constantly disrupted by Allied bombing, could not produce the precision components in sufficient quantities. The proximity fuse represented more than just clever engineering. It was a triumph of industrial organization. Converting a laboratory prototype into a weapon produced by the millions required unprecedented coordination between scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and the military. Vannevar Bush, who oversaw the entire American wartime research effort, later identified the proximity fuse as one of his proudest achievements. The Office of Scientific Research and Development that he directed coordinated the work of 30,000 scientists across 300 universities and research facilities. The proximity fuse program alone involved over 100 manufacturers and thousands of subcontractors. This organizational capacity was something the Axis powers could not match. Germany had brilliant scientists and engineers, but they worked in isolated programs that often competed against each other for resources. Japan had skilled craftsmen who could build exquisite mechanical devices, but they lacked the mass production infrastructure to manufacture millions of precision electronic components. The proximity fuse was not just an American invention, it was an American industrial achievement, a demonstration of what coordinated scientific research and mass production could accomplish when properly organized and funded. Meanwhile, in Europe, the proximity fuse was about to have an even more dramatic impact. In June of 1944, 1 week after the D-Day landings in Normandy, Germany unleashed a new terror weapon against Britain. The V-1 flying bomb, known to the British as the buzz bomb or doodlebug, was a small pilotless aircraft carrying an 1,800 lb warhead. Launched from sites along the French coast, the V-1S flew at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour at altitudes around 3,000 feet. They were too fast for most fighters and too small for conventional anti-aircraft guns. From June 13 through late August, the Germans launched approximately 9,300 V-1S against Britain, an average of 120 per day. The small missiles caused massive damage and civilian casualties. During 2.5 months in 1944, the V-1S killed nearly as many British civilians as the entire Blitz of 1940 and 1941. Conventional defenses proved inadequate. Fighters could intercept some V-1S, but the missiles were dangerous to approach. Shooting one down risked being caught in the explosion. Some pilots learned to fly alongside the V-1S and tip them over with their wingtips, disrupting the gyroscopic guidance system and sending the bomb into an uncontrolled dive. But this technique required extraordinary skill and courage. Anti-aircraft guns were even less effective. The V-1S flew at the edge of effective anti-aircraft range, and their small size and high speed made them nearly impossible to hit with time-fused shells. During the first week of the campaign, anti-aircraft batteries shooting at V-1S in the coastal gun belt achieved only a 17% destruction rate. Thousands of shells were being fired for every missile destroyed. The combined chiefs of staff made a critical decision. The threat to London was too severe to maintain the restriction on overland use of proximity fuses. On June 12, 1944, they authorized the use of proximity-fused ammunition against V-1S over British territory. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Section T modified the proximity fuses to target the small, fast-flying bombs. The special fuses were installed in British 3.7 in anti-aircraft ammunition and American 90mm shells. Batteries equipped with the new ammunition were rushed to the southern coast of England. Within 4 weeks, the kill rate climbed from 17% to 79%. On one day near the end of August, anti-aircraft batteries using proximity fuses destroyed 82% of all incoming V-1S. The ammunition expenditure dropped from thousands of shells per kill to around 100. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later said of the proximity fuse, "These so-called proximity fuses, made in the United States, proved potent against the small, unmanned aircraft with which we were assailed in 1944. The success against V-1Es defending England led to another urgent deployment. After the British 11th Armoured Division captured the crucial port of Antwerp in September of 1944, the Germans redirected their V-1 attacks against this vital logistics hub. Without Antwerp, the Allied armies pushing into Germany could not be supplied. The port had to be defended at all costs. The V-1S launched against Antwerp flew at even lower altitudes than those targeting London, some as low as 1,200 feet. This made them harder to intercept with fighters, but brought them within range of anti-aircraft guns. The problem was that the fuses designed for the higher flying missiles over England were not optimized for these lower altitude targets. Section T engineers worked around the clock to modify the fuses for the new threat. The modifications were rushed into production at the Crossley Corporation factory in Cincinnati, Ohio. British Prime Minister Churchill personally authorized a special flight of Lancaster bombers to transport the modified fuses from Cincinnati to Europe. The gamble paid off. When the first wave of modified fuses reached the anti-aircraft batteries defending Antwerp, the results were immediate. 48 of the first 75 V-1s facing a single anti-aircraft battalion were destroyed. The port remained operational throughout the winter of 1944 and 45, ensuring that Allied armies had the supplies they needed to continue their advance into Germany. From October 1944 to March 1945, German forces launched 4,883 V-1s against Antwerp. Of these, only 12% reached the designated protected area. The rest were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, many of them by shells equipped with the modified proximity fuses. The defense of Antwerp demonstrated something important about the proximity fuse program. It was not a static achievement, a single invention that worked perfectly from the start. It was an ongoing effort that required constant adaptation to new threats and changing conditions. Section T maintained a rapid development capability throughout the war, modifying and improving fuses to meet each new challenge. But the greatest test of the proximity fuse was yet to come. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive on the Western Front. 300,000 German troops supported by tanks and artillery smashed into American lines in the Ardennes Forest. The assault, which became known as the Battle of the Bulge, caught the Allies completely by surprise. For 3 days, General Dwight D. Eisenhower had been forbidden from using proximity-fused artillery against ground targets. The restriction on overland use still applied, and the risk of German forces recovering a dud fuse remained a concern. On December 19, Eisenhower demanded authorization to use the weapon. The situation was desperate. German forces were advancing rapidly. American troops were being overrun. 2 days later, all restrictions were removed. 200,000 shells with proximity fuses, code-named ZIT, were rushed to the front. On December 16, shells burst 30 feet above the exposed infantry, showering shrapnel onto soldiers who had no cover and no warning. According to Patton, 700 German troops were killed in that single engagement. American infantrymen joked that the proximity fuse was a Christmas present for the Germans. Captured enemy soldiers described the bombardment as a series of sudden, brutal explosions for which there was no defense. The artillery seemed almost intelligent, detonating at exactly the right height to inflict maximum casualties. There was nowhere to hide. Even foxholes offered little safety from the steel fragments raining down from above. Desperate to understand this new weapon, German commanders offered rewards to anyone who could recover an intact fuse. None succeeded. The fuses were built to self-destruct if they failed to trigger properly, and the rare duds that survived impact buried themselves deep in the frozen ground. The psychological shock was enormous. Veterans who had survived years of combat suddenly faced a weapon they could neither predict nor protect themselves against. Artillery that once gave at least a few seconds of warning, the familiar whistle of incoming rounds followed by impact, now seemed to explode out of nowhere, detonating in mid-air above their heads. There was no warning and no chance to take cover. One captured German officer later described the devastating effect this had on troop morale across the Sauer River. He said his men had lost confidence in their ability to survive in the open. Every movement between positions, every crossing of open ground, felt like stepping into an execution chamber. The artillery seemed to know exactly where they were and exactly when to explode. The German High Command attempted to analyze captured fragments of proximity fused shells. They found electronic components, but could not determine how they function. Some German scientists theorized that the Americans had developed some kind of infrared sensor. Others speculated about acoustic triggers. The true operating principle, a miniature radar sending and receiving radio signals, was never identified. This intelligence failure had strategic consequences. German forces could not develop countermeasures against a weapon they did not understand. Attempts to jam radio signals were ineffective because they did not know which frequencies to target. Efforts to develop decoys failed because they did not know what the fuses were detecting. The Battle of the Bulge marked a turning point not just in the war, but in military technology. For the first time, an electronic smart weapon had been used on a massive scale in ground combat. The implications were profound. Artillery was no longer simply an area weapon useful for suppressing enemy positions, but requiring direct hits to destroy hard targets. With proximity fuses, every shell became a precision weapon, lethal across a much larger area than conventional ammunition. After the battle, Patton wrote to Major General Levin H. Campbell, JRB, the Chief of Army Ordnance. His letter has become one of the most famous endorsements of any weapon in military history. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I'm glad that you all thought of it first. Patton was right about needing new methods of warfare. The proximity fuse had fundamentally changed the mathematics of artillery combat. Soldiers could no longer assume they were safe in the open between explosions. Every shell was now deadly across a much larger area. Dispersal and concealment became essential survival tactics. Secretary of the Navy James Forstall offered his own assessment. The proximity fuse has helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without the protection this ingenious device has given the surface ships of the fleet, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. By the end of the war, American factories had produced over 22 million proximity fuses at a cost of approximately $1 billion, roughly $15 billion in today's currency. The cost per fuse dropped from $7,002 in 1942 to just $18 by 1945 as mass production techniques were refined. The program remained classified throughout the war. Japanese and German soldiers died by the thousands without ever understanding what was killing them. It was not until September 20, 1945, weeks after Japan's surrender, that the existence of the proximity fuse was revealed to the public. The scientists and engineers who created it received little public recognition. Merle returned to the Carnegie Institution after the war and resumed his research in geophysics. He never sought fame for his wartime work. James Van Allen went on to discover the radiation belts that bear his name using instruments launched into space on early American satellites. He became one of the most celebrated scientists of the space age. But few people knew that his first great contribution had been a tiny spring inside a vacuum tube. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, created specifically for the proximity fuse program, continued operating after the war and remains active today. It has developed numerous defense technologies over the decades, building on the foundation laid by Section T. The laboratory's creation itself was a remarkable story. In early 1942, Section T had outgrown its space at the Carnegie Institution. Tuve negotiated an arrangement with Johns Hopkins University to establish a dedicated research facility. The university rented a 3-story building in Silver Spring, Maryland that had formerly housed a garage on the ground floor and Social Security Administration offices above. This unlikely location became the birthplace of one of America's most important defense research institutions. By 1944, the Applied Physics Laboratory employed over 700 scientists and engineers. D. Luke Hopkins, a member of the Johns Hopkins Board of Trustees, threw the full weight of the university behind the project. Equipment, laboratory space, and administrative support flowed to the FUSE program. The partnership between academic research and military necessity produced results that neither could have achieved alone. The women who assembled the fuses deserve special recognition. In factories across America, from Massachusetts to Ohio to California, thousands of women spent the war years performing microscopic assembly work that required extraordinary patience and precision. They wound tiny coils, mounted miniature vacuum tubes, and soldered connections so small they required magnifying glasses to see. Many developed eye strain and repetitive stress injuries. The work was tedious and demanding, yet they persisted day after day, knowing only that their work was important to the war effort. When the secrecy was finally lifted in September of 1945, these women learned for the first time that they had helped build one of the war's most important weapons. Some received recognition. Workers at plants that met production quotas were awarded Army-Navy E-pins, the highest civilian award for wartime industrial achievement. But most simply returned to their pre-war lives, their contribution to victory known only to themselves and their families. Commander William S. Parsons, the naval ordnance officer who served as liaison between Section T and the Bureau of Ordnance, went on to become famous for a different reason. He was the weapons officer aboard the Enola Gay on August 6, 1945, responsible for arming the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. His earlier work on the proximity fuse is largely forgotten today. The fuse technology itself continued to evolve after the war. Modern proximity fuses use solid-state electronics instead of vacuum tubes. They employ sophisticated radar systems and computer-controlled timing. Some use laser range finding. Others combine multiple sensing technologies for greater reliability. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged. A projectile senses its distance from a target and detonates at the optimal moment to inflict maximum damage. This concept, born in Merle Tuve's laboratory and perfected by James Van Allen and thousands of unnamed engineers and factory workers, revolutionized warfare and continues to shape military technology today. Admiral Lewis Strauss, who served on the Manhattan Project Oversight Committee and later became chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, offered perhaps the most succinct assessment of the proximity fuse's importance. He wrote that while no one invention won the war, the proximity fuse must be listed among the very small group of developments such as radar, upon which victory very largely depended. Historian James Finney Baxter III, in his official history of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, wrote that if one looks at the proximity fuse program as a whole, the magnitude and complexity of the effort rank it among the 3 or 4 most extraordinary scientific achievements of the war. Yet the proximity fuse has largely been forgotten by history. The atomic bomb commands far more attention. Radar is widely credited with winning the Battle of Britain. The proximity fuse, despite saving countless lives and changing the nature of warfare, remains obscure. Perhaps this is because the fuse killed rather than threatened. The atomic bomb was so terrible that it ended the war through the mere promise of destruction. Radar provided warning, allowing defenders to prepare, but the proximity fuse simply made death more efficient. It turned near misses into kills. It made artillery deadlier without making it more visible. There is no monument to the proximity fuse. No museum exhibit tells its story in full. The women who assembled